Today we'll be talking about the exposition of Mozart's Piano Sonata First Movement, K309. Now, in pieces that include a repeat of the exposition, figuring out where the exposition ends is actually pretty easy because you can just scan ahead and look for the repeat sign. So scrolling through this particular piece, we see that there's a repeat at the end of 58, marking the fact that this is the end of the exposition, and then the performer is instructed to go back to the beginning and play that a second time. Because of that, we actually know that the development starts in measure 59. All right, so concentrating on the exposition for right now, we'll notice that this piece starts in C major. For a major mode sonata form, we would expect the secondary key to be the dominant key. So looking again at the end of the exposition for a second, we can see that indeed we have modulated to the dominant key, in this case G major. And at the very last bar of this exposition does reconfirm that with a perfect authentic cadence in G major, which, as I said, is the dominant key. Speaking of cadences, let's kind of go through here and look at cadences. As I'm sure you heard in your listen through of this exposition, we start with this opening phrase. Then we have this interesting moment in bar 8 where the downbeat of bar 8 is actually serving two purposes. In relation to the 7 bars that came before, this is the first perfect authentic cadence of the piece. What's interesting is that given the similarity measure 8 has to measure 1, this downbeat is simultaneously serving as the end of the first phrase and the launch of the second phrase. This is an interesting moment that's known as a phrase overlap. Phrase overlaps can occur in any genre. They're not unique to sonata forms. It's just that this piece happens to have a particularly clear example of one. What's also interesting is that at the end of that phrase, we get that looped elision here with the perfect authentic cadence arriving at the same moment that the next phrase begins. But then that phrase doesn't seem to actually cadence. It's almost as if the piece is like, well, I don't really want to get stuck in that same 8-bar loop. And what's interesting is that that segment, that repeated segment, just seems to lose its way, kind of pausing here on this F major triad, which in the key of C major, of course, is functioning as 4/6. So we don't even really get a cadence here. And then in bar 15, it just sort of picks up with a new idea, saying, okay, well, why don't we try something new instead? And that new idea lasts about 3 bars, and it seems here in measure 17 that we're about to reach a perfect authentic cadence. We have a dominant chord here. We have a trill on scale degree 7, which is one big signifier that we're about to cadence. But notice what happens here. We get another immediate repetition of what happened in bar 15. So bar 15 and bar 18 are very similar. Notice that it's just block repeating what we had before, delaying the true cadence until all the way to measure 21, where we get a perfect authentic cadence. Notice that this perfect authentic cadence is still in the tonic key. Continuing to look ahead, we start getting many more accidentals after that perfect authentic cadence in measure 21. One accidental that occurs with particular frequency is F sharps, as you can see looking at this system down here. A lot of the harmonies are featuring F sharps. This is signifying that we're switching into the dominant key, G major. Notice that we land on a D major chord. Notice that this is approached by stepwise motion in a passage that seems to be functioning in G major. So this is acting as a half cadence in the dominant key, G major. Then we get this silence here, which is significant because to go through this section again in terms of the sonata theory terminology that we discussed in the previous video, the very first player on the stage is the primary theme. In this case, the primary theme has basically 2 long phrases or 3 phrases. It depends on how strict your definition of phrase is here. But in any event, we have that 8-bar opening, the overlapped modified 8-bar repetition, and then that section starting at 15 that's trying to find some way of cadencing in the tonic and manages to finally cadence in the tonic in measure 21. Then at 21, we see that we have completely contrasting material that is increasing the rhythmic energy in many regards. We also have an increased use of sforzandos or forte pianos in this case, along with the crescendo markings frequently. This is signifying that we have moved on in the sonata stage, especially since we are modulating in this passage. So the downbeat of measure 21 marks the beginning of the transition. There are several features that are very typical of transitions that this passage illustrates. One is that it's extremely common for the perfect authentic cadence to arrive right on the downbeat of the transition. Once again, having a phrase overlap where in an elided cadence, where the cadence arrives at the moment that a new phrase begins. Another thing that's very typical is, again, the increase in rhythmic energy. Notice that the accompaniment pattern changes from vacillating eighth notes to repeated diads of eighth notes, so thickening the texture a little bit, which creates a louder sound, a little bit more of an aggressive sound here. Another thing that we see is some fragmentation and repetition. This particular transition does contrast what happened in the primary theme. If you compare the opening of P with the opening of TR, you can see that they're not resembling one another. So if we're talking about the transition, this particular transition is a good example of an independent transition. In other words, a transition that introduces new material rather than pulling material from the primary theme. Notice that this transition has a 2-bar thing, a 2-bar thing, and then a 2-bar thing followed by shorter segments. Notice how we go from a 2-bar segments to 1-bar segments starting here, and then half-bar segments starting here, driving all the way to that half cadence at the end. So we have this increase in rhythmic energy that's created partially through the shortening of these motivic segments, driving to that half cadence in bar 32. This half cadence is significant. This is the half cadence that ends the transition. In this case, we've ended with a half cadence in the secondary key, the subordinate key, the dominant key in this case, though it could have been a half cadence in tonic. But here we do end with a half cadence in the dominant key, and it is followed by a literal pause. This is a very clear example of an MC. Not all of them will be as clear as this example, but in this case we do get actual tutti silence in all voices. MC stands for medial caesura, medial meaning it separates the first half of the exposition, which is P and TR, from the second half of the exposition, which is S and C. After the medial caesura, there's a rather interesting moment here. It seems like the true tune that constitutes S really doesn't begin until a couple bars later here, but technically this is still part of S space. It's leading into S. We've basically clicked over into the new thematic zone. We've already cleared the first half of the exposition through the medial caesura. So if you wanted to be able to talk about subsections in here, you could say that this is an S0 section, and this is the true S1. All that means is that if you add in the 0 to it, you're saying that it's part of S, but it's really functioning as an introduction within S, and we have the real tune of S that picks up a couple bars later. Looking forward in terms of what's going on in S, we have some groupings here. The tune starts, as I said, in measure 35. Comparing to that to what happens in measure 39, those two sections are very similar. So you can see 39 resembles 35 quite closely. Actually, I think it's a literal repetition, yes? And then after that, we once again move into a larger segment that nevertheless has repetition built into it. So just to draw your attention to proportions for a second, we've got a 4-bar thing, another 4-bar thing, and then an extended section that seems to be driving towards a cadence. The excitement of the secondary theme, again, is when are we going to cadence? When are we going to reach that perfect authentic cadence that confirms G major, the secondary key here? So looking through this, we have several signifiers of where that cadence happens to arrive. One thing that is extremely stylistically typical is anytime you have an extended trill right before a cadence point, and especially if it's a trill on scale degree 2, which is what this is, or scale degree 7. You'll notice that the trill is screaming, all right, we're going to cadence now, and then we do actually reach a perfect authentic cadence on the downbeat of measure 54. Given that cadence, we might ask ourselves, okay, is that the end of S? Is that cadence, that EEC, the essential expositional closure that we've been driving towards? And in order to answer that question, you have to look at not just that cadence, but what happens right after that cadence. In this case, it does seem like that perfect authentic cadence has been accepted. This has moved on to new material. This opening here in 54 and 55 is not part of S. It's not immediately repeating. It doesn't seem to be saying, oh, wait, we're not quite done. Let's back up and try that cadence again. In this case, 54 is the first perfect authentic cadence that does manage to move on to new material, which means that the downbeat of 54 is our EEC, our essential expositional closure. Meaning, since we still have material that's still part of the exposition, that this remaining material is our closing theme. EEC and C will always occur basically simultaneously. You have the cadence that closes down S, and then the very next thing that you hear is C. Don't try to write these on two different pages or two different systems or any of that. These two things always belong together. Now, it's possible to have EEC and then there's no closing theme, because the EEC could come in the very last measure of the exposition, but that's less common than what we have here. Couple other details I'd like to draw your attention to in this exposition, especially in the secondary theme. I kind of alluded to this earlier, but basically the S theme proper is an extended sentence. Both the primary theme and the secondary theme often have some sort of periodic or sentential structure. Not always, but often. This is a good example of an S that's an extended sentence, though. We have a 4-bar basic idea, another 4-bar basic idea, continuation starting here in measure 43. There are a few moments where it could have cadenced earlier. Proportion-wise, I think this section works quite well cadencing in 54. But to look at what's going on harmonically for a second, 45 does reach a 5-7 chord. Notice that we get our typical cadential 6-4 followed by 5-7. But that's 5-7 in this measure is followed by a 1-6. Notice that the bass is like, nope, we're not quite done with this section yet. And that sense of not being quite done is reinforced with the fact that measure 46 is repeating with a few elaborations the material that we had in 43. So this is a pretty clear example of an evaded cadence. Again, heightening the drama, heightening the anticipation for the EEC that does arrive in 54. This sonata exposition is fairly straightforward. We have a very clear primary theme, clear transition, in this case an independent transition that drove to the very clear MC dividing the first half from the second half. Then we pick up with the secondary theme S, which had a little bit of an introduction, which was kind of interesting. But really all of this is about driving to the EEC at measure 54, which is celebrated and reinforced further with a closing theme that rearticulates the perfect authentic cadence in G at the end.